On the day I received my leukemia diagnosis, the world around me seemed to stop. The doctor's voice echoed in my ears, but his words felt distant, as if they were coming from underwater. Dr. John's face wore that mask of professional compassion as he told me he was sorry. I remember his exact words piercing through the fog in my mind. The test results are conclusive. You have leukemia. I stumbled out of the examination room and somehow made my way to my car. I sat behind the wheel, tears streaming down my face, unable to even start the engine. How could this be happening? I was only 35, with my whole life ahead of me and a family who needed me. The word leukemia kept echoing in my mind like an endless reverberating bell, each ring bringing new waves of terror and despair. After what felt like hours, I finally managed to collect myself enough to drive home. My mind was a whirlpool of thoughts during the entire drive. I kept rehearsing in my head how I would tell my husband Andrew and my mother-in-law Donna, who lived with us. I wondered how I would explain this to my little daughter Charlotte. While anxiety gripped me at the thought of their reactions, I felt a strange glimmer of hope. I convinced myself that I would find the support and love I desperately needed in them at this moment. When I reached home, I paused at the door, taking a deep breath to gather my courage. Inside, I found Andrew and Donna watching television in the living room. They turned to look at me with mild curiosity on their faces. My voice trembled slightly as I told them I needed to talk. Andrew turned off the television, and they both looked at me with expectant expressions. I sat down on the sofa across from them, nervously wringing my hands in my lap. I told them I'd been to the doctor today for my test results, and that I'd been diagnosed with leukemia. The silence that followed my words was deafening. I had expected shock, concern, maybe even tears, but what I saw in their expressions made me freeze. My husband of 10 years, the man I'd shared my life with, let out a short, dry laugh. It felt like a physical slap across my face when he dismissed my diagnosis, suggesting it was probably just anemia. I protested, telling Andrew this wasn't an exaggeration, that the doctor had been very clear about my leukemia diagnosis. My mother-in-law Donna looked at me with a mixture of contempt and disbelief in her eyes. Her words cut through me like a knife when she accused me of being dramatic and seeking attention. I couldn't believe how cruel and insensitive they could be. The pain of their disbelief was worse than the diagnosis itself. Fresh tears welled up in my eyes, but this time they came from anger and disappointment rather than fear or sadness. My voice trembled as I cried out, asking them how they could say such things. I couldn't believe they thought I would make up something as serious as this illness. Andrew stood up, shaking his head with a mocking smile that cut through me like a knife. He suggested, with cruel sarcasm, that if I wanted attention so badly, I should try taking art classes instead of making up stories about being sick. Donna nodded in agreement, her condescending tone making me feel small as she told me I was too young for leukemia, claiming it was a disease for the elderly or children, not someone in the prime of their life. I couldn't believe my ears, feeling as though I'd stepped into some bizarre nightmare. The people who were supposed to love and support me were treating my diagnosis like some kind of sick joke or desperate plea for attention. I felt like I couldn't breathe, the walls of the room seeming to close in around me. How can you be so cruel? I whispered, my voice barely audible through my tears. The tears streamed freely down my cheeks, each one carrying the weight of their betrayal. I told them, through my tears, that I had just received the most shocking news of my life, and here they were, laughing and accusing me of lying. Andrew approached me then, his face now wearing a mask of false concern that only intensified my pain. He tried to placate me with patronizing words about getting a second opinion, insisting this must all be some misunderstanding. His words, meant to comfort, only pushed me further into despair. I jumped up suddenly, moving away from him as if his touch might burn me. I told him firmly that I didn't need a second opinion. What I needed was my family's trust and support, but that seemed too much to ask for. Donna let out an exasperated sigh that felt like another slap in the face. She dismissed my pain entirely, telling me I was always making mountains out of molehills and suggesting I should just get some rest, as if a good night's sleep would somehow make this nightmare disappear. I felt something break inside me at that moment. The coldness of her words, the complete lack of empathy, hit me with such force that I physically staggered. Without another word, I left the room and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step feeling like I was carrying the weight of their betrayal. Once I reached the safety of my room, I closed the door and collapsed, my body racked with sobs. I couldn't understand how my family could be so cruel at the moment when I was at my weakest, when I needed their love and understanding the most. I cried for hours, replaying the scene from the living room over and over in my mind. Each laugh, each sarcastic comment, each doubting look played on repeat in my head, amplifying my pain and sense of isolation. I felt utterly betrayed, abandoned by the very people I trusted most in this world. As night fell and the house grew quiet, I made my decision. I knew I couldn't face this battle surrounded by people who dismissed my suffering and refused to believe me. I had to find strength within myself and seek support elsewhere, even though the thought terrified me. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and searched for Melissa's number, my closest friend. I desperately needed someone who would listen to me, someone who would believe my truth. When she answered, her warm, concerned voice felt like a healing balm to my wounded heart. Through my tears, I whispered her name, Melissa. I told her I needed help, that I had just received the worst diagnosis of my life, yet my family thought I was lying. As I poured out everything that had happened, I felt a tiny glimmer of hope breaking through my despair. Even though I might not have my family's support, I wasn't completely alone in this darkness. Melissa listened and offered her unconditional support, helping me glimpse a path forward, though it wasn't one I'd ever imagined walking. That night, as my family slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life could change so dramatically in just one day. The leukemia diagnosis was terrifying, but my family's reaction had been even more devastating. I realized then that the battle ahead would be fought on two fronts, not just against the disease, but against the loneliness and incomprehension of those who should have been my strongest supporters. After that shocking conversation with Andrew and Donna, I was completely exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I had cried until there were no tears left, and then I lay in my darkened bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The house's silence felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional creaking of wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I realized I needed water. My lips were dry, and my throat ached from all the crying. With tired, slow movements, I got up from the bed and headed for the door. Just as I was about to turn the doorknob, I heard voices in the hallway. I froze, immediately recognizing Andrew's and Charlotte's voices. I heard Charlotte, my 10-year-old daughter, asking her father what was wrong with me, saying she'd heard me crying. Her childish voice carried a note of worry that pierced my heart. I held my breath, listening to how Andrew would explain the situation to our daughter, hoping that perhaps now he would show some compassion and acknowledge the seriousness of my diagnosis. But Andrew's response made me freeze in place. He told her not to worry, that I was just being dramatic as usual, saying that she knew how I got when I claimed to be sick. My heart felt like it was shattering into 1,000 pieces. How could Andrew be so insensitive and cruel? But what I heard next completely devastated me. I heard Charlotte's soft giggle through the door. My blood ran cold as I heard her mocking words, saying how I always claimed to be sick whenever I wanted attention, reminding everyone about the time I had complained of a headache during her piano recital. I couldn't believe my ears. My daughter, my little Charlotte, was making fun of my pain. Just when I thought I had no tears left, silent bitter tears began to flow again. I heard Andrew agreeing with her, and I could imagine the smirk on his face. He was telling her about my leukemia diagnosis, his tone dripping with sarcasm, as if someone could make up such a thing. When Charlotte repeated the word leukemia, for a brief moment, I foolishly hoped she might show some concern. But then she laughed again, her voice light and mocking. She joked about what I might claim next, suggesting I might say a third arm was growing from my back. I heard Andrew joining in her laughter. Their combined laughter echoed through the hallway, piercing my heart like a knife. I stumbled away from the door and collapsed onto the edge of my bed. My mind was reeling, unable to process the cruelty of what I'd just heard. I couldn't understand how we had gotten to this point. When had my family turned into such a callous, mocking group of people? My image of a loving, supportive family crumbled before my eyes, revealing a much darker and more painful reality. I spent the rest of that night in a state of shock, unable to sleep, replaying my husband's and daughter's cruel words over and over in my mind. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through my window, I made my decision. I couldn't stay in this house surrounded by people who not only didn't believe me but mocked my suffering. Like a robot, I began packing my suitcase. I stuffed in all the toiletries and important documents I could find. As I packed, my mind wandered through past events. They have taken on a new, bitter meaning. I wondered how many signs of this lack of empathy I had overlooked over the years. How many hurtful words and inappropriate laughs had I justified away? When I finished packing, I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone with trembling fingers. I dialed Melissa's number. Melissa answered the phone with a sleepy voice, asking what was wrong at such an early hour. My voice trembled as I tried to maintain composure while telling her I needed help. I explained that I couldn't stay here anymore and needed a place to stay for a few days, asking if I could stay with her. There was a moment of silence before she responded, her voice now fully awake and filled with concern. She immediately told me that her home was my home, asking what had happened. I briefly told her about what I'd heard last night. I told her how my own daughter had mocked my diagnosis. Melissa listened quietly, only occasionally making sounds of indignation and support. She told me to come right away. She said she would be waiting. After thanking Melissa and hanging up, I let out a deep sigh. I stood up, grabbed my suitcase, and quietly left the room. I walked down the stairs and headed toward the front door. A part of me hoped that someone would wake up, stop me, and ask me to stay. But the house remained silent. Before leaving, I left a short note on the kitchen table. I wrote that I would be away for a while, needing time and space to process my diagnosis and begin treatment, asking them not to contact me, and saying I would reach out when I was ready, signing it simply Haley. I quietly clicked the back door shut, feeling as if I was closing a chapter of my life. The fresh morning air hit my face, bringing with it a strange sense of freedom mingled with deep pain. As I walked toward the bus stop, my mind was already planning the next steps. I knew I needed to contact my doctor, arrange treatment, and probably find a support group. The thought of fighting leukemia alone was terrifying, but somehow less frightening than fighting it surrounded by people who didn't believe me. On the bus to Melissa's house, I watched through the window as familiar streets passed by. Every building, park, and corner held memories of life with Andrew and Charlotte. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, like parts of a life that was no longer mine. When I arrived at Melissa's house, I was exhausted but strangely peaceful. She greeted me with a strong, warm embrace. It was the kind of embrace I had hoped to receive from my family the previous day. She whispered to me that I would be safe here. She promised we would get through this together. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt a glimmer of hope. Though I had lost the support of my blood family, I was finding a new family in friends like Melissa and the medical professionals who were helping me fight leukemia. That night, lying in Melissa's guest room bed, I made my decision. I would cut off all contact with Andrew, Donna, and Charlotte. It was painful, but necessary. I needed to surround myself with people who would support and believe in me. I couldn't waste precious energy dealing with the denial and cruelty of those who should have given me unconditional love. As I drifted off to sleep, a strange peace enveloped me. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with both medical and emotional hurdles. But at least I felt confident that each step I took was in the right direction, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. The separation from my family was undoubtedly painful, but it also gave me an opportunity to rediscover myself and build new connections based on mutual respect and compassion. As I fell asleep, I thought about how this unexpected gift had emerged from tragedy. Days at Melissa's house turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Her support during this time was invaluable, but I knew I needed to find my own path. So I decided to move to a small town. Somewhere where nobody knew me, where I could start fresh. When I arrived in that picturesque town perched on a cliff, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. The taxi dropped me off in front of the small apartment I had rented online. As I carried my suitcase up the stairs, I couldn't help thinking about everything I'd left behind. A warm greeting welcomed me. An elderly woman with a kind smile introduced herself as Sandra, my neighbor across the hall, telling me to let her know if I needed anything. Her smile warmed my heart. I thanked her and introduced myself as Haley, explaining that I had just moved from the city. She asked me, with genuine curiosity, what brought me to this place. I hesitated for a moment before answering. I told her I needed a change, a fresh start. Sandra nodded understandingly, as if reading between the lines. She said sometimes new beginnings were exactly what we needed, and this town was perfect for that. Her words would prove prophetic. In the days and weeks that followed, I immersed myself in town life. I explored the cobblestone streets, marveled at the impressive bridges, and gradually felt myself becoming part of this small community. One morning, while drinking coffee in the nearby plaza, I discovered a poster advertising a cancer support group at the local health center. My heart pounding, I made the decision to attend the next meeting. On the day of the meeting, I entered the room nervously. About 10 people sat in a circle, their faces alternating between determination and exhaustion. A middle-aged woman wearing a colorful headscarf welcomed me warmly. She introduced herself as Megan, the group coordinator, asking if this was my first time. I nodded and shyly introduced myself. I told them my name was Haley and that I had been diagnosed with leukemia a few months ago. Megan's warm smile accompanied her words as she assured me that this was the right place for me. She told me that everyone here understood what I was going through. For the next 2 hours, I listened to stories of battles with illness, tales of fear, and narratives of hope and triumph. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt truly understood. When my turn came to speak, the words poured out like a flooding river. I told them about my diagnosis, my family's reaction, and my decision to distance myself. A man named Michael spoke after I finished, telling me that what I had done took great courage. He added that while leaving everything behind wasn't easy, sometimes it was necessary for healing. When I left that first meeting, I felt lighter than I had in months. I had found a group of people who not only believed me but truly understood my experience. As time passed, my life in the town began to take shape. The support group became an essential part of my routine. Not only did I find understanding there, but I also received practical advice about dealing with treatment side effects and strategies for maintaining a positive outlook. My relationship with my neighbor Sandra deepened as well. We spent many afternoons sharing tea on her balcony, engaging in conversation. She shared stories of her younger days in the town, while I talked about my life in the city, carefully omitting the most painful details. One day, Sandra spoke words that touched me deeply. She told me that when I first arrived, she had seen shadows in my eyes, but now she could see light there. She added that whatever I had left behind, it seemed I had made the right choice. Her words resonated deeply within my heart. She was right. Even while facing the challenge of fighting illness, I had built a more peaceful relationship with myself than I'd had in a long time. The leukemia treatment was brutal. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, days when the pain and nausea seemed endless. But even in those darkest times, I felt an inner strength I never knew I possessed. One afternoon, while walking along the trail and gazing at the valley below, I experienced a sudden revelation. Though the illness was terrifying, it had given me the opportunity to rediscover myself. Looking back then, I had left behind a life filled with toxic relationships and unfulfilled expectations. In this small town, I had built a new life based on authenticity and mutual support. As time passed, my health began to improve. The doctors were optimistic about my progress, though they warned the road ahead was still long. Each small victory, each improved blood test, was celebrated not just by me, but by the entire community that had formed around me. Megan, the support group coordinator, had become a close friend. She was the one who suggested I start keeping a journal about my experiences. She told me one day that my story could help others. She believed I had an inner power that could inspire people. Following her advice, I began to write. Though it started as a way to process my own emotions and experiences, I gradually began sharing parts of my journal at group meetings. The response was overwhelmingly positive. After one meeting, a newly diagnosed woman told me that my words gave her hope. She said they made her believe she could overcome this too. As the years passed, my bonds with the town and its people grew stronger. I no longer felt like an outsider, but rather an essential part of this community. The apartment that had once felt so foreign has become a true home, filled with happy memories and meaningful possessions. Sometimes, I thought about Andrew, Donna, and Charlotte. I wondered how they were doing, if they ever regretted how they treated me. But these thoughts no longer carried sharp pain. Instead, I felt a kind of distant compassion. They had missed the opportunity to be part of my journey of recovery and growth. Several years after coming to this town, I stood again on that walking trail. It was the same spot where I had my revelation years before. The sun was sinking into the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. I took a deep breath, feeling the warm wind caress my face. I whispered, "Thank you," to the wind, though I wasn't quite sure who or what I was thanking. Perhaps it was to life itself for giving me this second chance, or maybe to myself for having the courage to start anew. As I walked home, I reflected on the long journey I had taken. Leukemia had been a brutal battle, but I had fought it with dignity and strength. The emotional scars of my family's abandonment were still there, but they no longer defined who I was. In this town, I had found more than just a place to live. I had found purpose, community, and most importantly, I had found myself. As the town's lights began to flicker on, I realized this was the most precious gift of all. The years in this town had brought me not just physical and emotional healing, but a new purpose in life. My experience with leukemia and the process of rebuilding myself had given me a unique perspective to share with others. It all began one afternoon after a particularly moving support group meeting. With an idea I had been turning over in my mind for weeks, I approached Megan, who was still serving as the coordinator. I called out to her, my heart racing with anticipation. I shared my thoughts about creating an organization to help people with leukemia, not just in our town but throughout the city. Megan looked at me with a mixture of surprise and enthusiasm on her face. She told me it was a wonderful idea and asked what specific plans I had in mind. For the next few hours, Megan and I discussed the possibility of establishing a nonprofit organization. We envisioned creating a space that would provide emotional support, practical information, and resources for people diagnosed with leukemia and their families. I suggested calling it Light in the Storm, remembering my own darkest times. Megan nodded in agreement. She said it was perfect, expressing both hope and strength. The following months were a whirlwind of activity, preparing legal documents, fundraising, and recruiting volunteers. Though we barely had time to catch our breath, each obstacle overcome and each small victory filled me with energy I didn't know I possessed. Finally, a year after my initial conversation with Megan, Light in the Storm opened its doors in a small office in the heart of town. On opening day, as I cut the red ribbon before a small crowd of supporters and local journalists, I felt an overwhelming mixture of pride and humility. In my opening address, I spoke for all those fighting their silent battles. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Our organization grew rapidly beyond our expectations. What began as a small support group in our town quickly spread to other cities in the region. We established offices in 3 cities, creating a 24-hour helpline, a companion program for newly diagnosed patients, and wellness workshops for survivors. My role as founder and director of Light in the Storm led me to places I never imagined I'd go. I found myself giving lectures at hospitals, participating in cancer conferences, and appearing on local television programs to raise awareness about leukemia. Then came the phone call that would change the direction of our organization. It was from a producer of a popular national television show. The producer told me they had heard about my work with Light in the Storm and wanted me to share my story on their program. I accepted the invitation with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. As I sat in the green room of the city studio preparing, I couldn't help but marvel at how much my life had changed. Just a few years ago, I could barely get out of bed due to treatment side effects, and now here I was, about to appear on national television. The interview was intense and moving. I shared my story openly, from my initial diagnosis to my family's painful reaction, my move to the small town, and the establishment of Light in the Storm. The host, with tears in her eyes, told me my story was truly inspiring. She asked what words I would share with someone newly diagnosed with leukemia. I took a deep breath before answering. I told them they weren't alone, that it was okay to be scared, but there was hope, to surround themselves with people who would support and believe in them, and to remember they were stronger than they thought. The response to the interview was overwhelming. In the days that followed, our website crashed from the volume of visitors. Our office phones rang constantly with people offering donations and asking how they could help. My story went viral on social media, bringing messages from across the country sharing their own cancer experiences and thanking me for giving voice to their struggle. One morning, while checking emails in the office, I found a breathtaking letter. It was from a 16-year-old girl named Sophia. Her letter began with a "Dear Haley." She wrote that she couldn't stop crying while watching my interview, that she had been diagnosed with leukemia 2 months ago and felt terribly lonely and scared, but my story had given her hope and made her believe she could overcome this too, thanking me for being her light in the storm. This letter was just the beginning. Our office soon became flooded with similar letters. They were stories of struggle and fear, but also of hope and determination. Each letter reminded me why I had begun this journey. With growing recognition came new opportunities. I was invited to international cancer conferences, established partnerships with hospitals and research centers, and even launched a scholarship program for young researchers dedicated to fighting leukemia. 9 years after my initial diagnosis, I stood on a stage in the city, receiving a national award for Light in the Storm's work. Holding the trophy, I looked out over the audience and saw familiar faces. There was Megan, Sandra, members of the original support group from our town, and volunteers from each office. In my acceptance speech, I spoke from my heart. I told them this award wasn't mine alone, but belonged to everyone who had been part of this journey. Every patient who shared their story, every volunteer who gave their time, and every supporter who believed in our mission. I paused for a moment, feeling emotion well up in my throat before continuing. I shared how 9 years ago, I had received a diagnosis I thought would end my life, but instead, it had given me a new purpose, teaching me that our greatest storms could become our greatest strengths. That night, back in my hotel room, I reflected on the long road I had traveled. I thought about the Haley from 9 years ago, frightened and lonely in her city bedroom. I wished I could tell that version of myself that everything would be okay, that she would find strength she never knew she had. Looking out the window at the city lights, I felt deep gratitude for the second chance life had given me, for the amazing people I'd met along the way, and for the opportunity to make a difference in others' lives. While leukemia had been the most challenging chapter of my life, it had also been my greatest transformation. It had taught me the true meaning of strength, resilience, and the power of community. As I prepared for bed, I smiled thinking about all that was yet to come. Light in the storm continued to grow, and through each new person we helped, I felt I was fulfilling my purpose in this world. The next day would bring new challenges and opportunities. And I was ready to face them with the strength I'd found in my own storm and the light I could now share with others. It was just another Tuesday afternoon in the Light in the Storm office. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the conference room with warm golden light. As I was reviewing documents for an upcoming conference on advances in leukemia treatment, my cell phone began to vibrate on the desk. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was probably a collaborator or perhaps a journalist requesting an interview. As the vibration continued, something compelled me to look at the screen. I froze at the name displayed there. It was Andrew, my ex-husband, the man who had laughed at my diagnosis 9 years ago, whose cruelty had pushed me toward a new life. I wondered why he would contact me after all this time. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, hesitating for a moment before sliding my finger to answer. In a whispered voice, I managed to say hello. I heard Andrew's voice, asking if it was really me. His voice was different then. Trembling and desperate, completely unlike the mocking tone I remembered from our last conversation. I struggled to maintain my composure as I confirmed it was me. I asked him what he wanted. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. The silence was broken only by what sounded like suppressed sobs. He told me he needed my help, that something terrible had happened. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain they had caused me, a part of my heart still cared. I asked him what had happened and if Charlotte was all right. His voice trembled as he told me that Charlotte was having problems. He added that there was more. That Donna, my former mother-in-law, was very ill. I remained silent, processing this information. Donna, who had laughed at my illness and encouraged Andrew and Charlotte's cruelty, was now suffering from an illness herself. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction, a kind of poetic justice, but that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by an unexpected wave of compassion. In a voice softer than I expected, I asked about Donna's condition. Andrew took a deep breath before answering. He told me it was pancreatic cancer, terminal, and that the doctors said she didn't have much time left. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words. I remembered my own diagnosis and the terror and despair I had felt. I knew that no one should experience that alone, not even someone who had hurt me so deeply. From my heart, I told him how sorry I was to hear that. But I had to ask why he was calling me after 9 years. With a voice mixed with shame and admiration, he told me he had seen me on television. He explained that after seeing what I had accomplished with my organization and how I helped cancer patients, he thought I might be able to help them, adding that he felt lost, with Donna suffering and Charlotte out of control. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. On one hand, I felt a strange sense of power, holding the ability to help or refuse those who had hurt me so deeply. On the other hand, I felt a profound empathy. I knew exactly what it meant to face a devastating diagnosis, to feel lost and terrified. I spoke slowly as I addressed Andrew. I told him that what he was asking wasn't simple, that there was too much history between us. Andrew interrupted me with a desperate voice, saying he understood. He admitted that he had no right to ask anything of me, that what they had done and what he himself had done was unforgivable, but he pleaded with me to do it not for him, but for Donna and Charlotte, saying they needed me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Memories of those dark days after my diagnosis came flooding back. The pain, the loneliness, the sense of betrayal washed over me like a wave. Yet at the same time, I remembered how that experience had led me here, given me purpose. Finally, I told Andrew I needed time to think. I explained that this was too big to process all at once. Andrew responded with relief in his voice, clearly grateful I hadn't immediately refused. He told me to take all the time I needed, but pleaded with me to consider helping them, even though they didn't deserve it. I cut him off, telling him I would call. I couldn't bear to hear any more. I promised to contact him once I had made my decision. After hanging up, I sat in my office chair, staring out the window. Though my eyes were fixed on the view, I wasn't really seeing anything. The setting sun was painting the town's sky in shades of red and gold. It was beautiful, but I barely noticed. My mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The prospect of seeing Donna and Charlotte again filled me with anxiety. I wondered how I could face the people who had hurt me so deeply. How could I help them without reopening old wounds? Yet I couldn't help thinking that this was exactly what Light in the Storm stood for. Helping people in their darkest moments, regardless of who they were or what they had done. Wasn't this why I had founded this organization, so no one would have to experience what I had experienced? I stood up and walked to the window. As I watched the last rays of sunlight disappear into the horizon, I remembered the words I had spoken so many times to patients and their families. That it's in our darkest moments when we need the light of hope the most. I wondered if, despite everything that had happened, I could become that light for Donna. I questioned whether I could find the strength within myself to forgive and help those who had abandoned me when I needed them most. Though I didn't have clear answers, I knew that my decision would define not only my relationship with the past, but also the future of Light in the Storm and everything it symbolized. As the sun completely set, giving way to the rural starlit sky, I made my decision. The next day, I would call Megan and the rest of the team. I needed their advice and support. Because I knew that whatever decision I made, I couldn't do it alone. Andrew's phone call had opened a door I thought was permanently closed. And now, standing on that threshold, I had to decide whether to step into the unknown or finally close that door for good. With a sigh, I turned off the office lights and prepared to head home. The next day would bring a new day filled with difficult decisions and complex emotions. But for now, I needed rest and reflection. Walking along the town's cobblestone streets under the starlit sky, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and peace. I knew that whatever decision I made would come from a place of strength and compassion. Because that was who I had become over the past 9 years. I was no longer the frightened, wounded victim. I was a survivor, a healer, and a light in the storm. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to bring that light back to the darkest corners of my past. The morning after Andrew's call dawned gray and rainy. It was as if the town sky reflected the emotional storm churning inside me. After a restless night's sleep plagued by nightmares of the past and visions of an uncertain future, I woke up early. As I made coffee in my small apartment kitchen, my mind kept circling back to yesterday's conversation. Andrew's words echoed in my head. He had told me that Donna was very ill, that Charlotte was troubled, that they needed me. Holding my warm coffee cup, I sat by the window and watched the gentle rain against the glass. It had been so long since I had thought of them as family. 9 years of distance, personal growth, and building a new life. And now, suddenly, the past was knocking at my door, demanding acknowledgement. I picked up the phone and dialed Megan's number. Before making any decision, I needed her advice. Megan's voice was filled with concern as she asked if I was all right. It wasn't like me to call so early in the morning. I told her I needed help, and began explaining about Andrew's call and the situation with Donna and Charlotte. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Megan spoke. She acknowledged how complicated this was and asked how I was feeling. I let out a deep sigh. I admitted that I honestly didn't know, explaining that part of me wanted to help, as this was what Light in the Storm did, helping anyone facing cancer, but another part of me was terrified. Megan continued, telling me that was completely understandable, reminding me how cruel they had been. I felt my throat tighten as I agreed with her. But I wondered aloud if refusing to help now would make me just as cruel. Megan paused for a moment before responding. She reminded me of how far I'd come, how since coming to this town, I'd helped so many people and become a light for them, but the question was whether I was ready to be that light for the people who had once left me in darkness. Her words struck deep in my heart. I wondered if I was truly ready. Could I face Andrew, Donna, and Charlotte without being consumed by the pain of the past? I admitted to Megan that I didn't know. But I told her I needed to find out. After talking with Megan a bit more, I made my decision. I would call Andrew and hear what he had to say. I wouldn't make any promises. But at least I would give him a chance to explain. With trembling hands, I dialed Andrew's number. After 3 rings, he answered. I heard him say my name. His voice was a mixture of hope and fear. I worked to keep my tone neutral as I greeted him. I told him I'd been thinking about what he'd said the day before, and that I needed to hear more, asking him to tell me exactly what was happening. I heard him let out a relieved sigh. He thanked me repeatedly for just listening. Then Andrew began to reveal the detailed situation. His words painted a dark picture of the past 9 years, so different from the life I had built in this town. Andrew explained that Donna had started feeling ill several months ago. He told me they initially thought it was stress or perhaps depression, but when she finally agreed to see a doctor. His voice trembled as he spoke. He revealed the devastating diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and the doctors said it was inoperable. I felt a pang of sympathy as I remembered my own diagnosis and the terror that came with it. I softly acknowledged how difficult this must be for him, telling him I understood how terrifying that moment could be. Andrew continued with a voice full of guilt and regret. He told me that something broke inside Donna when she received her diagnosis, that she started talking about me, about how terribly they had treated me when I told them about my leukemia, believing this was karma, a punishment for their cruelty. I caught my breath at her words. I never expected Donna, the woman who had laughed at my illness, to feel such remorse. I asked about Charlotte. Andrew paused, as if struggling to find the right words. He told me Charlotte wasn't coping well, that she'd started acting unstably after learning about her grandmother's condition, skipping classes and hanging around with the wrong crowd, and then last week, they had found her unconscious in her room from an overdose. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. My little Charlotte, once the center of my world, had tried to take her own life. Despite years of separation, despite all the pain they had caused me, my heart felt like it was being torn apart for her. Andrew continued in a whisper. He told me she was in treatment but struggling, filled with guilt and confusion, talking about me often, about how they had treated me, and how seeing me on television and my accomplishments had deeply affected her. I fell silent for a moment, trying to process all this information. The situation was far more complex and painful than I had anticipated. Finally, I asked Andrew why he was telling me all this now, after 9 years. There was a long silence before Andrew answered, and when he did, his voice carried an emotion I had never heard before. He admitted they had been wrong, terribly wrong, and now, facing Donna's illness and seeing Charlotte's suffering, they were realizing how cruel they had been, how much they had needed me but pushed me away instead. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. 9 years of suppressed emotions threatened to overflow. Andrew continued, telling me he had seen me on television. He spoke about seeing the organization I had founded, how I helped people facing cancer, and how he realized that if anyone could help them through this, it would be me, not just because of my cancer experience, but because I knew them, knew their flaws and mistakes, and had still achieved so much, forgiven and healed. His words struck deep in my heart. I wondered if I had truly forgiven. I questioned if I had really healed completely. Or had I just pushed the pain so deep that I couldn't feel it anymore? I spoke slowly as I addressed Andrew. I told him that what he was asking wasn't simple, that there was too much history between us. Andrew quickly responded that he understood. He said he would understand if I wanted nothing to do with them, but he begged me to help, not for his sake, but for Donna and Charlotte, saying they needed me, my strength, my experience, someone to show them this could be overcome. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make. On one hand, the thought of becoming involved in their lives again terrified me. The memory of their hurt was still raw, despite the years that had passed. Yet on the other hand, wasn't this exactly why I had founded Light in the Storm? To help people in their darkest moments, regardless of who they were or what they had done. Finally, I told Andrew I needed time to think. I explained that this was too big to process all at once. He agreed, relief evident in his voice. He was clearly grateful I hadn't immediately refused. He told me to take all the time I needed, but pleaded with me to consider helping them, even though they didn't deserve it. I cut him off, not wanting to hear any more. I promised to call when I had made my decision. After hanging up, I sat in silence, staring out the window. The rain continued to fall over the town. Andrew's confession had shaken my world, unearthing emotions I thought I had long since overcome. Donna was facing terminal cancer, Charlotte was struggling with depression and guilt, and Andrew had finally acknowledged the hurt they had caused. It was overwhelming. It felt as if the past and present were merging, creating an unavoidable crossroads in my life. I stood up and walked to the small altar I had created in the corner of my living room. There was a photograph of me from my early days in this town. Though I was gaunt from treatment, my eyes held a determined sparkle. Next to it stood a candle and a small journal where I recorded my thoughts and reflections. I lit the candle, sat before the altar, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. I needed to find clarity in this storm of emotions. Could I truly forgive? Could I face the past without being consumed by it? I wondered how helping them would affect the life I'd built in this town, Light in the Storm, and the person I'd grown to be. I opened my eyes. Watching the candle flame flicker gently, I remembered the words I'd spoken so many times to others. That it's in our deepest darkness when we need the light of hope the most. Despite everything that had happened, could I become that light for Donna, Charlotte, and Andrew? Could I find the strength within myself to forgive and help those who had abandoned me when I needed them most? Though I didn't have clear answers, I knew my decision would define not only my relationship with the past, but also the future of Light in the Storm and everything it symbolized. As the rain continued outside, I sat before the altar, seeking wisdom and strength to face this new challenge. I knew that whatever decision I made, it wouldn't be easy. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was the time to bring the light I'd found in this town back to the darkest corners of my past. The days following Andrew's confession were a whirlwind of emotions and deep reflection. Every morning, the same question pounded in my heart. What should I do? The answer was never clear, as I wavered between my desire to help and my instinct to protect myself from past pain. One afternoon, while walking the cobblestone streets seeking clarity in the mountain's fresh air, I found myself standing before a church. Though I wasn't particularly religious, something compelled me to enter. Inside, it was dim, lit only by candlelight and sunbeams filtering through stained glass windows. As I sat in one of the wooden pews, the silence of the place wrapped around me like a blanket. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in days, let all my emotions flow freely. The pain of betrayal, the fear of reliving the past, sympathy for Donna and Charlotte's suffering, confusion over Andrew's remorse. It all swirled into an emotional vortex that took my breath away. Sitting there in the church's silence, I had an epiphany. This decision wasn't just about Andrew, Donna, and Charlotte. This was about me, the person I'd become, and the values we stood for at Light in the Storm. Why was I preaching compassion and forgiveness if I couldn't practice it in my own life? With this new clarity, I left the church and headed straight to the office. Before making my final decision, I needed to talk with Megan and the rest of the team. When I arrived, Megan was reviewing documents. Seeing me, her face filled with concern. She asked if I was all right, telling me I looked different. I sat down in front of her and took a deep breath. I told Megan I had made my decision, but needed her and the team's input before taking action. For the next hour, I shared everything with Megan and the rest of the team. I told them about Andrew's call, Donna's illness, and Charlotte's troubles. I spoke about my doubts, fears, and the recent revelation I'd had in the church. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Patricia, one of our psychological counselors, was the first to speak. She told me that what I was considering took incredible courage, but it was also incredibly difficult, asking if I was truly ready. I nodded slowly. I admitted to Patricia that I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I was certain it was the right thing to do. Megan looked at me with an expression that mixed pride and concern. She assured me that she would support whatever decision I made, but reminded me that I didn't have to do this alone, that they were all here for me, just as I had been there for so many others. Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. I looked around the room. As I gazed at the faces of those who had become my family over the past 9 years, I felt a wave of gratitude and strength wash over me. With tears in my eyes, I thanked them. I told them I couldn't have done any of this without them. With the team's support, I made my final decision. That night, sitting in my small apartment, I dialed Andrew's number. My heart pounded heavily as I waited for him to answer. I heard him say my name. His voice held a mixture of hope and fear. I worked to steady my voice as I greeted him. I told him I had made my decision. Silence fell on the other end of the line, and I could imagine Andrew holding his breath, waiting for my words. Finally, I told him I would help. I explained that he needed to understand something. This wasn't about returning to their lives, but about doing what was right, what we did at Light in the Storm, helping anyone facing cancer regardless of their past. I heard Andrew let out a relieved sigh. He thanked me, saying I couldn't understand how much this meant to them. I continued with a firmer voice. I made it clear that this wouldn't erase the past, that what he had done to me still left deep scars, that while I could help, I wasn't ready to fully forgive, and wasn't sure if I ever would be. There was a moment of silence before Andrew responded. Andrew told me he understood and accepted that, acknowledging they didn't deserve my forgiveness but expressing deep gratitude for my help. We worked out the practical details together. I agreed to meet them the following week in the city to assess Donna's situation. We also arranged to meet with Charlotte's therapist to explore ways to help her recovery. After hanging up, I sat in silence, experiencing a mixture of fear, anxiety, and an inexplicable sense of peace. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, but I also knew it was the right one. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. I adjusted schedules at Light in the Storm, delegated responsibilities, and ensured everything would run smoothly in my absence. I also had several sessions with Patricia, our counselor, to emotionally prepare for what awaited me in the city. The night before my departure, while packing my suitcase, I found an old photograph at the bottom of my drawer. It was a picture of Charlotte and me, taken shortly before my leukemia diagnosis. We were happy then, or at least I thought we were. As I gazed at the smiling faces in the photograph, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and pain. I felt the urge to put the photo back in the drawer, to let it remain buried in the past. But something stopped me. Instead, I carefully placed it in my suitcase. Not as a symbol of what we once were, but as a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd grown. The next morning, I waited at the airport for my flight to the city. Watching planes take off and land through the window, I felt an odd mixture of tension and determination. Megan had insisted on accompanying me to the airport, staying with me until the very last moment. While we waited, she took my hand and looked into my eyes. She gently reminded me that no matter what happened, I had a home in this town and a family in Light in the Storm. Her words gave me renewed strength. I nodded and squeezed her hand. I thanked her for everything. When my flight was finally announced, I stood up and grabbed my suitcase. Megan gave me one last hug before I headed to the boarding gate. She told me I had always been that light. Walking toward the plane, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the unknown. But this time was different from when I'd fled the city 9 years ago, scared and hurt. Now I was moving forward with purpose and strength. As the plane took off, I sat in my seat, watching the city grow smaller and more distant through the window. Yet I could feel that strength within me. The strength of the mountains that had embraced me, the strength of the people who had become my family, and the strength of the life I had built from nothing. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't know what awaited me in the city, or how I would react when I finally saw Andrew, Donna, and Charlotte after all this time. I wasn't sure if I could really help them, or if I could control my own emotions. But one thing was certain. I was no longer the Haley who had fled the city 9 years ago. I had become stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. I was a survivor, a healer, and a light in the storm. And now, that light was returning to the darkest corners of my past. Not to stay, not to return to who I once was, but to illuminate the path of healing. For Donna, for Charlotte, for Andrew, and most importantly, for myself. As the plane climbed above the clouds, I felt a strange sense of ending. A chapter of life I thought was closed was about to receive an unexpected epilogue. But this time, I was the author of my own story. With that certainty in my heart, I allowed myself to relax in my seat. Though the flight was short, I knew the journey ahead would be long and challenging. As the plane landed at the city airport and began taxiing, I felt a strange emotion seeing the familiar landscape through the window. 9 years ago, I had fled from this very airport. I had been wounded, betrayed, and filled with despair. And now, I was back. But this time was different. I was different. Andrew was waiting for me in the arrival lobby. He had aged, with considerable gray in his hair. Dark circles of exhaustion showed under his eyes, and his shoulders drooped as if carrying a heavy burden. When he spotted me, he raised his hand slightly. That gesture held none of his former arrogance. He quietly said my name. He thanked me for coming. I responded calmly, telling him I had come for Donna. And for Charlotte. During the car ride, the city scenery flowed past before my eyes. Familiar buildings and streets appeared and disappeared like photographs in an old album. As Andrew drove toward the hospital where Donna was staying, he explained her situation. Her condition was rapidly deteriorating, and the doctors had said she only had weeks left. When I entered the hospital room, I froze for a moment. The Donna lying in the bed bore no resemblance to the proud, cold mother-in-law in my memories. She looked frail and all too human, with her thin frame and pale face. She whispered my name as she opened her eyes. She asked if it was really me. I told her yes, it was me. Tears welled up in her eyes. In a hoarse voice, she apologized. She said she was truly sorry for not believing me then, for hurting me, for everything. I sat beside her bed and took her trembling hand. I told her it was in the past. Though it wasn't complete forgiveness, it was a beginning. Later, I went to see Charlotte. She was recovering at a treatment facility in the suburbs. My daughter, now 19, had become someone entirely different from the 10-year-old girl in my memories. Yet the pain and confusion in her eyes mirrored what I had once felt myself. She hesitantly called me a mom. That word pierced my heart. It was the first time I'd heard "mom" in 9 years. Charlotte broke down crying and threw herself into my arms. The following weeks were like an emotional storm. There was Donna's care, Charlotte's counseling, and the gradual revelation of truths from the past 9 years. After I left, the family had slowly fallen apart. Andrew had buried himself in work, Donna had been consumed by regret and guilt, and Charlotte had grown up in an environment devoid of love. Yet through this ordeal, I made a new discovery. The healing power within me wasn't just for supporting patients. It was also a force that could heal past wounds and create new understanding and empathy. Donna passed away quietly and peacefully. As she held my hand tightly, she spoke her final words. She thanked me for letting my light shine through her darkness. After the funeral, Charlotte decided to return to the small town with me. She told me she wanted to start anew there, just like I had done. With Andrew, we reached a complex reconciliation. Though complete forgiveness wasn't achieved, we found mutual understanding and acceptance. He chose to stay in the city to rebuild his own life. On the flight back to our small town, Charlotte slept while gazing out the window. I watched her young face, contemplating life's strange twists and turns. Sometimes the deepest wounds can bring the greatest opportunities for growth. Light in the Storm evolved in a new direction. We began programs for family reconciliation and healing, addressing the complex emotional challenges faced by cancer patients and their families. Charlotte started studying psychology, telling me she wanted to work for the organization someday. My experience became a story that resonated with more and more people. It became proof that damaged relationships could be repaired and forgiveness could become strength. Standing on the clifftop path at dusk, looking down at the valley, I felt a deep peace. Life can take unexpected turns. Sometimes the darkest experiences can open paths to the brightest light. Charlotte approached from behind and stood beside me. She quietly thanked me. She expressed gratitude for accepting her. I embraced her tightly. I told her that this was life. I explained that we all experience our own storms, but what matters is finding the light within them and having the courage to share it with others. As the sun set behind the mountains, we felt the beginning of a new chapter. It might not have been a perfect ending, but it was the beginning of genuine healing. Sometimes the deepest darkness can produce the brightest light. And sometimes, we become the light that illuminates someone else's darkness. Perhaps that's the most beautiful truth of this life.